All right, well, continuing on with our coverage of the media coverage of the gun control debate, I want to go back to another Fox and Friends segment where, again, we see the anchors talking back and forth. No guests here. This is just the anchors ad-libbing. And as I've said before, a lot of what we're seeing here is an absence of knowledge, and that's evident. Let's go ahead and roll the videotape here.
We will never forget what happened that Friday at Sandy Hook Elementary School, but there are a lot of schools as a result of this who are now trying to do some things about the kind of violence that they've seen. A leafy suburb in New Jersey, for example, the town of Marlborough, adopts a schoolhouse Glocks being used to actually station permanent armed cops in each of its 9 schools starting January 2nd.
Yeah, now the mayor there made the decision not based upon Wayne LaPierre's suggestion. He, of course, was the main spokesperson for the NRA who came out on Friday with that press conference. He said he had made this decision after Newtown, but before he heard what the NRA had to say, and he just said, I mean, here's his thinking. Here's the mayor's thinking. He says, we've made a collective decision as a town that we need armed security in each of our schools. With this new evil, you can't just sit there and hope that it doesn't happen in your town. We must protect our kids. So starting January 2nd, that is what they will do when they reopen.
And earlier on the show, of course, we had a Marine, a father, I guess you're never really a former Marine, right? But he is
no
not
longer
active.
active service, yeah.
Who felt that he was compelled to stand guard outside of his child's elementary school because he said, what else are you going to do? He's not armed, as you can see in the photos, but he showed up in uniform and just standing there 8 hours a day. Listen to this father.
They're my kids. What choice do I have? It's either I sit back and I wait on something else to happen or someone else to protect them, or I get up and I do something and I protect my kids. They drew cards for me, and that said they felt safe. I don't know if you can see them or not, but there's stockings right here that says Mom, Dad, and Sergeant Pritchard. And this came from a little girl who wrote in here that she felt extremely safe with me standing out there. I can't describe the feeling, honestly.
There's no one answer to this. I mean, people on social media, you know, there's tempers out there all over the place on this. And there's no one correct answer. And as Michelle Malkin pointed out...
Let's stop right there for a second. This was the guy yesterday who was complaining about, or the clip that we showed earlier in the week, complaining about the cost of doing $5 billion a year. This is going to cost. I mean, that's a lot of money. $5 billion. Now you see the Marine standing guard. You see the mayor of New Jersey who came to this decision, as was pointed out before Wayne LaPierre of the NRA, made his statement. And then these anchors again. I hate to say it, but it's almost like we talk about low information voters. One of the things about low information voters is the last thing they hear and the last thing on their mind is sort of what makes up their mind. Hurricane Sandy was a big decision and a big event for low information voters outside of the Northeast, and how the president handled this. What if we have low information anchors? And what if the last story they hear tends to reflect their thinking over the next 30 or 45 seconds? I mean, it seems to be what we're seeing here. Here's a guy, the cost. Oh, I don't know about this, because they had been talking to a guy who, I don't know about this idea. Then again, you see the Marine standing guard outside of his child's school, wanting the kids inside to be safe. You hear about the mayor, and there's no one answer here. We could have all kinds of answers. And note, by the way, he still has not yet actually come out and said, well, this may be a good idea. But let's listen. Maybe he will.
On the show yesterday, perhaps we all need to take a moment of national pause and reflect and hear other viewpoints from other individuals.
Well, I mean,
because this problem would have been solved already if one person had the answer.
Of course, anybody who thinks that there's one solution is being too simplistic. But that's what, hopefully, God willing, these task forces that the president has called for and others are calling for will come up with. Because also having an armed guard at a school does not always work, as we know from the tragedy.
Now, as we pointed out last night, This is an argument that we're hearing a lot. Well, having an armed guard wouldn't always work. Having a gun ban won't always work. I mean, if that's the argument, in fact, you know what? Having a gun ban will never work. Senator Feinstein's semi-auto ban, big bad new gun ban bill that she's introduced, knock on wood, won't go anywhere, but could pass, get signed into law, and would do nothing to prevent these types of tragedies from occurring. And you know what? The lawmakers themselves say this. They say, well, this won't prevent a tragedy, but we have to do something. Well, that's what the lawmakers say. What do the parents say? Do we get a say? Because if we get a say, I say, as a father of 5, let's not do something. Let's do something effective. And you know, you're right. There are no absolutes in this world, Fox Inker. There is no one thing that will guarantee that a tragedy like this will not take place in the future. But let me ask you this. President Obama comes on TV. He says, my fellow Americans, we're going to take a bold step to protect our kids. He could say, we're going to ban all guns. Or he could say, we're going to make sure that every child in America has the same protection as my kids, and as Rahm Emanuel's kids, and as David Gregory's kids. We're going to make sure that every school has somebody there who, if they're not a active law enforcement official, they are a retired cop, they're retired military, they've got the training, they've volunteered their services, they're there to protect our kids. Honestly, which one do you think is going to be more effective? I mean, forget about your feelings about gun control. Forget about your feelings about guns. Because this isn't about guns. It's not about gun control. It's about our kids. That's what we've been told. I would agree with that. So what's more effective? We know about the effectiveness of gun bans, or should I say the ineffectiveness. Look at Chicago, or D.C., or Camden. Look at the ease with which convicted felons can get their hands on firearms. And by the way, even in England, in the 10 years after their gun ban went into effect, crimes involving firearms went up, nearly doubled. Gun bans don't work. And if we're talking about our kids, let's do something that does. All right, let's go back to Fox and Friends.
Tragic example of Columbine. There was a uniformed armed deputy there who was assigned to Columbine, but sadly he also had other duties, and that day was not inside the school when the gunfire broke out from those 2 teenage gunmen. He was able to shoot at the gunmen. He was able to fire at them, but they still managed to kill 15 people and wound 23 that day.
Other duties you mentioned, and Kelly, we were talking about this earlier, which is...
So, let me get this straight. Because 13 years ago, when 2 individuals did such terrible things, and by the way, law enforcement across the nation has learned a lot from that and how to respond to active shooter scenarios from that. But because the deputy who was there on duty was not able to successfully kill the perpetrators, was able to engage them, delay them from killing who knows how many more, did save lives in my point of view, was able to help evacuate students from that building. Are you saying the deputy didn't serve a useful purpose that day? Even if he was not able to get both of the perpetrators, are you saying he didn't matter? Is that the argument? I got to tell you, my mind is blown right now, and it has been for the past couple of days, listening to these people poo-poo the idea of security for our kids. I don't understand it. But let's listen to some more.
These other duties and budget cuts, right? I mean, this is part of the issue here. You talk about the cost, right? $6 billion to try to put armed individuals in schools across 100,000 schools, $6 billion, other duties, because schools are having forced to cut their budgets.
Well, you go back to what the mayor of Marlboro.
Let's stop. Yeah. Remember how this conversation started. You got a mayor in New Jersey. You got a Marine standing guard. By the way, since this airs, or since this has aired, now the Attorney General in Arizona has put out a proposal to, and he says, again, best scenario, police in every school, but that may not be possible. So he suggests arming a principal or one designated official to keep a firearm to prevent school shootings, much like an armed pilot program. And the most we got out of these anchors was, well, there's no one solution to this, but let's start, again, criticizing the idea here. And now we get into the cost, these $6 billion. Keep in mind that since Barack Obama became president, we have run deficits of over $1 trillion a year. The idea that the line in the sand, the fiscal line in the sand, where we won't stand for this wasted money. You're telling me that's going to come from school security. That's where we're going to say no more. Really? I got to tell you, I've not pored over the federal budget. Fox has a much larger news staff than NRA News. Perhaps they could go line through line. And I bet you could find $5 billion that 90% of Americans would say was wasteful spending. Just utterly wasteful. And we could put that money to good use. By the way, again, some perspective. $5 billion a year. That's 10 Cylindras. $5 billion a year. That is that's 20% of a GM bailout. All right, $5 billion is real money. Don't get me wrong. But this is the first time in recent memory I can recall hearing some people complain about the cost of something. I mean, heck, you think you'd have these folks talking up the stimulative measures that would come from putting more police officers in our schools. But no. All right, let's go back to the segment here.
He said, this is not a luxury. We can spare no expense in order to safeguard our children. But in practicality, as you were alluding to, Clayton, there are a lot of school budgets that are already very meager because they just can't afford to run things operationally as they should. So now you're talking about adding the component of armed security there. And we talked about this retired Marine soldier actually standing out in front of his children's school. Well, they're talking about actually employing retired police officers and retired members of the military. That costs money.
It costs money, and you talk about the other costs and things.
Stop again. So why? You're right. You're right. I never thought about it. That costs money. All kinds of things cost money. And you know what? I'll give you a couple of other pithy little sayings. Doesn't grow on trees either. But here's the thing. We have priorities in our life. And if you are a parent, not always, but it should be that the number one priority are your kids. So I got to tell you, I would love to see the polling on this argument of, well, $5 billion, it's going to break the bank. I'd love to see the polling among parents for this argument. I'm guessing single digits. We heard the President of the United States say This was a time, this was not an ordinary time. We heard the president say this was a time for self-reflection. And you know, he's right about those things. This isn't normal. This is not a usual time. We aren't seeing a normal response from parents, from Americans across the country. There is no real hue and cry for gun control, by the way. You've seen the polling. That's obvious now. What people do want are kids to be safe, or at least safer. And again, $5 billion after GM, after 4 years of $1 trillion deficits, really $5 billion. Do you know what an insult that sounds like when we're talking about our kids? All right, let's listen to more here.
They've cut back on. There's been a discussion about mental illness. Well, schools are coming out and saying, wait a second, and the National Association of Educators saying, wait a second, we've cut back, been forced to cut back on guidance counselors.
Right.
And so, wait a minute, we're going to cut back on guidance counselors and then put armed individuals in our schools?
Right, I've heard that too, that if they just had trained guidance counselors or mental health task forces in schools, it might prove to be as good protection as an armed guard who could spot these kids who were clearly sending off warning signs before they...
Stop. Are any of these people parents? What the hell are you talking about? A guidance counselor would be more effective than a police officer because you could identify these things. You know who will be able to identify these problems? Mom and dad. If it gets to the point where the school guidance counselor is the one who's figured it out and nobody else has, the teacher hasn't, the lunch lady hasn't noticed, the principal hasn't noticed, mom and dad hasn't noticed, do you think guidance counselors are bestowed with magical powers? They can see things that other people can't. They can. What are you talking about? Now, again, by the way, for any guidance counselors out there, you're cool in my book. I'm not objecting to the idea of guidance counselors. What I am objecting to is this desperate clinging to the idea that there has to be some other way. There's got to be something better than the idea of armed guards. Maybe it's guidance counselors. Ha, ha, ha. I mean, you know, it sucks that we've gotten to this point. It does. But for those of us who have kids and we want our kids to be safe, we don't have to turn our schools into prisons. We don't have to have SWAT teams at every corner. I'm cool with the same security setup that Rahm Emanuel's kids have at the school that they go to. One cop. And again, if it's okay for Rahm Emanuel, and it's okay for folks who send their kids to private schools with security, and by the way, it's okay for the kids in about a third of our schools across the country where there already is armed security. Why? What is the deep-rooted problem with saying every kid deserves to have that same level of security? I don't understand it. But they are just desperately grasping for anything other than the idea that armed security works, and that's why people who can afford it have it. All right, let's go back to this segment here.
They did anything. But, you know, again, these are the answers. These are the conversations we need to be having, and hopefully we will come up with answers of how to tackle this in short order.
Tell you,
let's get to your headlines right now and tell you what else is happening at this hour.
No, that's not the conversation. If I was sitting there with them to talk, that would be a conversation worth having. But the three of them, really? What did you learn from that conversation? The three of them. All right. we have more, sadly, we have more of these to share with you. But again, that's another look at some of the media chatter surrounding the gun issue.